Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to be here. Dr. Martha C. Nussbaum is the author of numerous watershed books concerning moral, legal, and political philosophy. She is widely respected for her commitment to human well-being, including her work on the philosophy of emotions and her development of the capabilities approach, a measure of global welfare that has shaped conversation about human rights. A score of honors includes most recently the 2021 Berggruen Prize, one of the largest international awards. In an interview about the prize, a colleague called Dr. Nussbaum an unconditionally generous scholar. She has written 27 books and edited just as many more. She has taught at Harvard, Brown, Oxford, and now the Free Library of Philadelphia. Her new book, Citadels of Pride, is a groundbreaking exploration of sexual violence and an indictment of the culture of male power that insulates abusers from accountability. Dr. Nussbaum, thank you so much for being here. The screen is all yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I was just saying that Philadelphia is my hometown where I grew up, so I'm very glad to be with you all. These are revolutionary times for American women and men. A recent flood of testimony has shown that for generations, our society has harbored a culture of sexual violence and sexual harassment. Many, many women have been treated as mere objects for male pleasure and use, their dignity disrespected, their inner experiences ignored. Now, this very old problem has entered the foreground of public awareness in a new way, challenging all Americans to heed belatedly women's long ignored demand for justice and equal respect. The decency and basic justice of our society hang in the balance. The information brought out by the Me Too movement that began in 2017 is not really new. For more than 50 years, American women have been telling their stories of sexual violence and workplace harassment in pursuit of justice for all women. And many creative and determined lawyers and policymakers have been working hard to reshape both criminal and civil law to deal more adequately with both sexual assault, a criminal offense, and sexual harassment, defined in our country as the civil offense of sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. One objective of this book is to tell that frequently ignored set of stories so that we understand that America's march to justice has been long and is the work of many unheralded contributors, not just recent celebrities, valuable though the contributions of the latter have been. America's unfinished march toward equality for women and men has made progress over the years, and the Me Too movement has begun to make yet more progress. But there remain significant barriers to full accountability. A second major objective of this book is to pinpoint these areas of recalcitrance and to analyze the reasons why they have resisted reform. I'll be arguing that greed is a major impediment. Men who seem irreplaceable and who make a lot of money for other people, especially in sports and in the arts and media, are still all too likely to be insulated from full accountability, their misdeeds covered up. The federal judiciary is another area in which powerful figures who often seem indispensable to those whose interests they serve are similarly insulated, at least until very recently, with reforms as yet far from adequate. Defects in accountability stemming from greed require institutional and structural solutions, and I propose some for each area. Above all, I argue that the vice that I call the vice of pride is at work in the still all too common tendency to treat women as mere objects, denying them equal respect and full autonomy. Pride, as I define it, really following Dante actually, is the vice that consists of thinking that you are above all others and that other people down there below are not fully real. This vice can be found at the source of several of the deepest problems in our national life, including racial superiority and privilege, and indifference and disdain on the basis of class. One place where pride has surely ruled is in relations between women and men. Dominant men, refusing women recognition as full and equal persons, have resisted the creation of laws that empower women to defend their bodily integrity and assert their agency. And even when, nonetheless, these laws manage to be created, many men resist their sway, creating outposts, which I call citadels of pride, where they take shelter and avoid accountability. Like any major social political revolution, ours is the best of times, meaning a time of budding hopes for full justice, but it is also, in a way, the worst of times, a time of pain and turbulence, when established patterns have been challenged, but people are very unsure about how to go forward and are often filled with resentment on both sides, responding to the injustices of the past and the magnitude of the changes. When Charles Dickens used those two descriptions to characterize the French Revolution, one thing he had in mind was that a push for justice can lead to an outbreak of retributive emotion that does not serve justice well and that actually retards human progress. Our time contains similar dangers where women and men are concerned. Ours is a time when women speak clearly and proudly, demanding justice and respect. It is also a time when some men react in fear and anger, resenting lost privileges and demonizing feminism as the cause of their discontent. And sadly, it's also a time when some women ask not only for equal respect, but seem to take pleasure in retribution. Instead of a prophetic vision of justice and reconciliation, these women prefer an apocalyptic vision in which the former oppressor is brought low, and this vision parades as justice. No, justice is something very different, requiring nuances, distinctions, and forward-looking strategies to bring the warring parties to the table of peace. In this book, I argued that on this issue, as with so many others, retributive emotion is no help. We all need to go forward somehow into a shared future, both women and men. And we need to start building that future now, rather than focusing on the infliction of retrospective pain. That's not to say that part of the institutional solution doesn't involve punishment of offenders. Punishment is useful and often necessary to deter the offender, to deter others from offending, to express society's most important norms, and to educate society as a whole about the importance of good behavior. But punishment accomplishes these legitimate goals only if it is law-based, fair, nuanced, and calibrated to the severity of the offense. The Me Too movement has seen its share of cases in which punishment has not been nuanced or calibrated, in which mass shaming through social media takes the place of procedural justice. It has also spawned narratives in which reconciliation is dismissed in favor of retributive triumphalism. Following the lead of both feminist Elizabeth Cady Stanton and great leader Martin Luther King Jr., I call for a revolution that fully recognizes the equal human dignity of all people and that moves forward to create a new world, a world in which, as King put it, men and women may live together, but let us say women and men, since it's high time for Americans to change the customary order of our thinking. In short, this is a book about justice, but a justice that seeks reconciliation and a shared future. This justice has a central role for law. Law and what's called the rule of law embody a vision of equal dignity and fair due process. And though law is finite and its process is flawed, American women have been able to turn to the law and to legal change in a way that hasn't always been possible for women in nations in which the law is more deeply flawed and corrupted at its very core. But law does its job well only when people understand it. And in America today, people interested in justice for women do not always understand the relevant laws and their background. A large part of my purpose in my book is to describe the relevant areas of the law and their history clearly, so that any reader who wants to use the law or study it further will be pretty well placed to do so. My discussion sometimes may seem technical because the impartiality of the law means that it is in fact technical. Narratives play a role in the evolution of the law, since ours is what's called a common law system, in which law develops incrementally through cases. And I will be telling the stories of some crucial cases. But I want my readers to embrace the larger goal of creating a system that stands for all and that is fair to all, standing above any narrative and, or so it should be, immune to bias and favor. The very abstractness of law embodies a noble moral ideal. We have worked hard to win our way past this or that particular story toward a vision of unbiased justice for all. We should not let the natural desire for narrative color betray that struggle. Law in that way embodies a vision of reconciliation. Each tells her own story, but not just for herself, seeking instead a result that brings all together and stands for all. Women's lack of full equality in American society has many dimensions: lack of equal pay, continuing obstacles to full political representation, the huge gnawing problem of care labor and its unequal distribution in families across the nation, the stubborn problem of women's vulnerability to domestic violence. Each of these deserves a book. In this particular book, I choose to focus on sexual assault and sexual harassment, in part because these issues are current flashpoints for women's demands for justice, for resistance to those demands, and for occasional retributive overreach. I believe a good approach to the difficult issues of sexual assault and sexual harassment will indicate a spirit in which other issues may be constructively addressed. The issues on which I focus, furthermore, are issues for which law has long been a culprit, giving women inadequate protection, and in which recent legal work has begun to undo that history of wrong. So they provide a valuable theater in which to study the interplay between legal and institutional change and underlying societal struggles. Well, now you know the book's overall scope and purposes. What has led me to engage with this topic at this time? First of all, over 30 years of feminist teaching and scholarship. Since around 1990, I've regularly taught a class called Feminist Philosophy, attempting to deal respectfully and fairly with all the major varieties of feminism. And I've learned from all the writings I teach. I've learned even more from my successive generations of students, especially from their critical challenges. I've also had the good fortune to spend the past 25 years at one of the nation's premier law schools, where I've been kind of a philosophical interloper, but I've been steeped in conversations about the criminal and the civil law, and have had daily conversations with some of the best legal thinkers about these issues. I am also a woman, and like so many women in our society, I have been a victim of both sexual harassment and sexual assault. And I see no value in narrating these experiences again. I've narrated them in print because we all know now that such things happen to lots of women. They're just not unusual. I also don't want this to be a narrative of victimhood, and I'm seeking a perspective that's fair to all involved, as I believe we also should do everywhere in life. So now I'll give you a capsule summary of the chapters of the book. In part one, I dive immediately into the attitudes and the emotions that brought Americans to this crisis and that impede a lasting and just peace. I look first at the key concept of objectification, treating a person as a mere thing, which illuminates much of the path before us if the concept itself is dissected clearly. I then focus first on a trait that fuels the longstanding objectification of women and the denigration of women's full equality, namely the vice of pride, which underlies so much abuse of power, along with its relatives, greed and envy. In Dante's masterful poetic account of the vice of pride in the Purgatorio, the proud are bent over like hoops so that they actually can't look out at other people. They can only see themselves. They treat others as objects because they see only themselves. They neither listen nor see. Because pride plays a pernicious role in racism and class inequality, as well as in sex discrimination, it offers us a way of understanding how one form of abuse is related to many others and intersects with others. And especially at this time in our national life, it invites us to reflect on how an unacceptable racial subordination and an unacceptable sexual subordination are intertwined aspects of a diseased national culture. In part 2, I turn to history and law. I give a brief account of the gradual revolution in criminal law that has led to more adequate standards for rape and sexual assault and to better treatment of victims. Because in the US, criminal laws are state laws, this revolution has of necessity been plural, messy, and complex. Meanwhile, at the federal level, feminists have pursued a different strategy, seeking protection against workplace sexual harassment by using 2 civil anti-discrimination laws, namely Title VII and later Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The key theoretical move was to get people to agree that sexual harassment is discrimination on grounds of sex. Before this feminist work, most men, and probably many women, thought that workplace harassment was a kind of bad behavior, erotically motivated, but few would have seen it as a case of discrimination. To secure agreement that it is in fact discrimination was a major victory of feminist thought and lawyering. Sexual harassment is a civil offense in which the defendant is not the individual perpetrator, but the institution. But a plaintiff can succeed if she can show that either some type of quid pro quo was demanded of her in the employment context, or that the harassment created what's known as a hostile working environment, and that her repeated complaints brought no redress. I examine the theory of sex discrimination that led to these legal developments and trace the main outlines of the case law. Sexual assault and sexual harassment, of course, can overlap, in fact, because harassment often includes some type of assault, although it needn't. But the two involve altogether different legal strategies, standards, and concepts. And one of my aims is to dispel prevalent confusion about these distinctions. Finally, in an interlude, I more briefly inspect the current atmosphere of controversy and uncertainty surrounding sexual assault on college and university campuses, suggesting how we may, going forward, strike an appropriate balance between accountability for victims and due process for the accused. One aim of part 2 is to make people more aware of the history and current situation of the law in these areas and areas in which further reform is needed. But I also focus on law because it is important to see, I think, that women have made progress less because of celebrities who tell their tales of abuse, important though these recent disclosures have been, than because of the tireless efforts of hundreds of working women, often working class women, plaintiffs and their lawyers, and of activists who pressed for legal change. And progress has been won not so much because of the public shaming characteristic of the Me Too movement, which I think is fraught with problems as much as promise, as because of impartial structures that both allow victims to be heard and protect the accused. Law can and must do better, but it is one of the best things we have. The fundamental issue, part 2 insists, is not sex, it is power. Sexual abuse and sexual harassment, as feminists have long contended, are abuses of power by people encouraged to believe that they are above all others and that others are not fully real. Culturally, Men have been the dominant group in hierarchies of power, so the abusers that this book considers are mainly male, but people lower in the power hierarchy may be victimized, whether male or female, and this book does consider some cases in which the victims of sexual abuse and harassment are male. My approach through Pride has three important consequences. First, sexual abuse and harassment should be seen as closely akin to other abuses of power, abuses on the basis of race or class. Second, at times sexual abuse itself targets males lower in the power hierarchy. Third, women are especially vulnerable to sexual abuse when they are also targets of a racialized or class-based abuse of power. This book is in a sense about women, but it's really about hierarchies of power and the abuses they engender in people who are raised to think that they're above the law. Part 3 then turns to recalcitrant areas of our national life. In some areas, despite Me Too, powerful men remain above the law. When men are shielded by long-lasting institutional structures that give them enormous power, they may continue to do wrong with impunity. These citadels of pride, as I call them, insulate men who objectify and demean women from accountability. I select 3 such areas to exemplify this problem. First, I examine the federal judiciary. Here, the cult-like structure of the clerkship, combined with inadequate structures to protect whistleblowers, has given rise to a corrupt sexual culture in which, given the power dynamics, women are more likely than men to suffer sexual abuse and harassment. I examine closely the careers of former Judge Alex Kaczynski and the late Stephen Reinhardt as examples of a culpable failure of accountability. Recent structural reforms instituted by a group formed by Chief Justice Roberts have improved things, but there's still a lot more work to be done. Impunity is heightened by greed, a frequent ally of the vice of pride. As my first examples of this problem, I look at the performing arts, where big stars who make a lot of money for other people are too often shielded by others. Here again, the structures themselves are defective, and the highly unstable nature of employment, especially in theater and film, magnifies the problem. Because the area of performing art that I know best is classical music and opera, I examined 4 cases from that field: David Daniels, Charles Dutoit, Plácido Domingo, and the late James Levine. Here again, I believe that reforms in institutional structures, already underway under pressure from labor unions, can achieve a great deal, but a vigilant public is also key to the prevention of further abuses. Finally, I study big money college sports, in particular Division I football and basketball. I study these after showing how in professional sports, tougher regulation and better contracts between players and management have begun to rein in sexual abuse, as in many other workplaces around the country. But the case of college sports, I argue, is different. Here, a collective action problem, as so many compete for such a small number of big talents, combined with financial pressure created by investment groups who ally themselves in dubious ways with the academic institutions, nurtures cultures of both sexual and academic corruption that the reform attempts of the NCAA have proven powerless to dismantle. Here alone, I argue that reform of the structures is not possible, and I recommend the complete abolition of Division I college football and basketball in favor of a minor league system such as baseball has long had. Here I'm echoing NBA Commissioner Adam Silver's call for dismantling the unhealthy nexus between colleges and investment companies and replacing them with genuine professionalization, as typified by the increasing success and quality of basketball's G League, combined, as Silver projects, with learning academies that will ensure, as the current system does not, that young athletes will have marketable skills should their sports careers not pan out. In all of these analyses, I draw on Part 1's account of the vices of domination focusing particularly on pride and greed. This is a tough book, one that does not allow the tender emotions to become an excuse for weakness or retreat from accountability. But it's also a book committed to finding a path forward. I argue that retributive emotions and demands do not provide that way forward. The only genuine opening to a shared future involves both tough-minded insistence on accountability and a spirit of constructive work, generosity of spirit, and what I would call affirmative love. Wounded people become retributive easily, and we should sympathize with this reaction to genuine trauma. But sympathy is not a justification. Parents who have lost a child to criminal violence often become obsessed with capital punishment and demand it. But that understandable response does not justify capital punishment or make the parent's attitude helpful or healthy. In criminal justice more generally, victims often become obsessed with revenge in an unhealthy way, and what are called victim impact statements in the penalty phase of criminal trials often taint the trial with retributive overreach, jeopardizing the fairness of the criminal process. There's much more than emotion involved in creating a culture of accountability with reconciliation. But as Martin Luther King Jr. knew and taught, getting the spirit and the emotions right is essential in guiding our more specific efforts. Many feminists do believe that retributive anger is a powerful aid to the feminist struggle, even if they also acknowledge that it may distort the personality. In keeping with my other work on anger and retribution, I argue in this book that the retributive type of anger, the type focused on inflicting retrospective pain, is no help in the feminist struggle. I'm with King, who said in 1959 that this type of anger is confused and not radical. It follows a blind strike-back impulse rather than asking what will help to create a world where women and men can live together. Denouncing bad policies and opposing people who hold them in their bid for high office is certainly a part of creating a good future. But that legitimate and principled denunciation is difficult to disentangle from the mere desire to win by putting your opponent down. We all need to constantly ponder that distinction, trying always for the future-directed type of anger that I call transition anger, meaning an anger that makes a transition to the future and says, that's outrageous and bad. How can we prevent that from happening again? As for public punishment by shaming, social media have in a way brought us back to the witch trials and the pillory, a culture in which it's possible to give people what sociologist Irving Goffman called a spoiled identity without due process and with no possibility of reintegration. I've long criticized the use of public shaming in the criminal law, as when people convicted of a certain offense are made to wear signs or placards on their car or on their property. Critics of this type of punishment have made 5 strong arguments. Number 1, these punishments assail human dignity by branding a whole person as defective, not just a single bad act. Number 2, they depart from the ideal of the rule of law, asking the crowd to administer the punishment. Number 3, throughout history, they have proven highly unreliable, migrating from people who have really done something bad to people who are merely ugly or unpopular. Number 4, they often increase the total amount of violence in society because they create despair, inciting a desperate type of retaliation. And finally, 5, by punishing many things that are not illegal, they contribute to what's known as net widening, increasing society's total amount of social control. All these arguments seem to me to have merit, but in the version of punishment by shaming recently proposed by criminal law thinkers, the suggestion has at least this mitigating factor. The person has to be indicted, tried, and convicted first. Shaming enters in only at the penalty phase. Even so, these punishments are vulnerable to my 5 objections. But in social media culture, as indeed with the use in many places and times of the stocks, the pillory, and punitive tattooing and branding, there is no trial first. The mob is district attorney, judge, jury, and punisher. The new ascendancy of mob anger and retributive shaming is, in general, in our society, a huge threat to the creation of a world of decency and mutual respect. I think it's sad that feminists who ought to see the ugliness of these strategies linked historically to witch blaming and other forms of misogyny, at times these days, and it's not very many feminists, but just some, seem to glory in public shaming, both of males and of dissenting feminists. The virtue opposed to the vice of pride is not humility in the sense that you think yourself lower than others. It's closely connected to respect and involves the willingness to see others and to listen to the voices of others, rather than closing off those voices in lofty superiority. Virtue at its best involves that type of inclusive listening, and something that, following the thought of Martin Luther King Jr., I would call love. That is, it involves seeing in all people a core of dignity and worth, and a potential for change and growth, however obscured and blighted by the history of that person's deeds. So it draws a very strong distinction between deeds and the underlying person. Deeds may be utterly denounced, but the person always retains potentiality and movement. That's why Dante's hell is so terrifying. These are human beings, but stripped of potentiality and therefore of hope. And when living people are consigned to that kind of hell, this is its own very pernicious form of objectification, robbing them of autonomy, subjectivity, and possibility. At this time of justified denunciation and unremitting vigilance, feminists, I believe, should also, and above all, be people of love. Just as women demand that our voices be heard, we must also resolve to hear one another in all our differences, and to hear the voices of men, both those who agree with us and those who do not, both those who have behaved well and those who have not, creating a dialogical culture that is also a culture of empathetic imagination. To listen and to hear in respect for human potentiality. And because that potentiality is sometimes impossible to see, we should also be people of practical faith and of a trust that is to some extent as yet unjustified and unjustifiable. Even where hope cannot be supported by reasons, and really hope can never be fully supported by reasons, feminists, I think, should also be people of hope. Hope that the relationship between women and men, so long based on domination, might enjoy what Abraham Lincoln called a new birth of freedom, as mutuality and respect for autonomy gradually displace pride. Only that new freedom and that love can really create a just and lasting peace. Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions.
Dr. Nussbaum, thank you so much for your talk and for your scholarship. I feel very glad that you are at the forefront for all of us in academia.
Yeah, I'm one. I mean, I'm one of many. You know, I don't think there's a forefront. That's why in my course, I just teach so many different people who've made valuable contributions. And it's important to hear one another. And I sometimes, when I think I disagree with the view so deeply that I can't represent it fairly, and I try to ask somebody else to teach that class. And I've gained more respect for some over the years and lost more respect. And, you know, but really you have to try to represent fairly everything that's there and see what's in it. And that's what I really tried to do. And actually, you mentioned my prize. The last prize I won, I used a lot of the prize money to endow a program in our law school, what are now called Nussbaum lunches, where two faculty who differ and have opposing points of view on some social issue get together a group of between 15 and 20 students who also have different opinions. And we spend 90 minutes having lunch and talking about the issue. And the only ground rule is civility and listening. And it's amazing how well it actually works. It's very difficult to get people who have opposing points of view into the same class. We're such a polarized society now that, people on the right usually don't take my feminist philosophy course. It used to be different. In fact, our most right-wing current faculty member took my feminist philosophy course when he was a law student, but not anymore. So you have to catch them when they're having lunch. And this is what we try to do to promote listening.
Here's one question from our audience this evening. You've given us so much to think about. I'll have to watch this again and read the book. Is this project a never-ending uphill battle against the basic biological makeup of our species, testosterone on the one hand and simple reptilian limbic revenge on the other? And since we've seen how fragile the rule of law is, the recent conservative Supreme Court shift overrunning the Capitol, is it wrong to think the law is ultimately aspirational more than it is effective?
Well, first, let's talk about biology, because I think this idea that the predominance of a single hormone makes the difference in a way of thinking is desperately wrong and terribly overplayed. And, both men and women have estrogen and both men and women have testosterone. The only thing is the proportions and the amount and so on. And the amount, we now know, is endogenous to the way the person is active in society and actually teaching. A great book by Anne Fausto Sterling shows that the biology of hormones actually follows what you do, so that women who are more successful then, as a result of that, have more testosterone. So there are all kinds of things to say about the hormones. And I think we know now that for all these emotions, the dominant factor is culture, familial culture, societal culture, peer culture. So we have to work on all these fronts. And of course, it's very difficult to work on all these fronts at once. But institutional culture really helps. When we think about sexual harassment, now there are people who once have thought and tried to say that men will always harass women in the workplace. That's just the way the male ego behaves. But actually, the minute there were laws against this, then first of all, it empowers the decent men who are always the vast majority. Now they don't have to just look the other way in embarrassment, but they really can do something. They can report this person and they can urge the woman to seek, to bring a legal grievance. And also, it really deters. I believe in deterrence very firmly. I think when a young boy grows up hearing the word sexual harassment, knowing that it's something bad and something for which you can suffer very grave professional consequences, that young man will learn not to do that. In my day in graduate school, everyone encountered sexual harassment. Just every woman I know encountered it, whether it took the form of an actual assault or just some other type of pervasive harassment. But nowadays, the people who are repeat offenders of sexual harassment tend to be, I would say, the more deeply troubled people who are less deterrable, but people who are deterrable have been deterred. I think it's a tremendous change. And I'm very proud of what the feminist movement, not me, it was before me, have done to create good structures that deter sexual harassment. Now, of course, bad behavior of all sorts is difficult fully to deter. I think that's true generally. But one thing, since I've talked about deterrence, I am very sympathetic with the British utilitarians who said that when you see crime, you have to ask, what are the social structures that made that crime take off? And Jeremy Bentham thought it was true of actually all criminal offending, that it was bad ways of life. He was thinking of poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunity, lack of healthcare, and so on. All those things that are still with us, those are the things that make crime take off. So when we see crime, we shouldn't just think, oh, now what do we do about crime? We should think, how did that come about? And we have to go back behind it and fix that. And of course, it's very, very hard. I actually think that getting on top of sexual harassment is an awful lot easier than getting on top of just healthcare, which is one of the worst problems we have to contend with in our society. And fixing the structures that lead so many young people to take up a life of crime, meaning structures of poverty, unequal education, unequal healthcare, unequal job opportunity. That's much harder than fixing the culture of sexual harassment in the workplace. And so, yeah, I mean, we have to keep struggling, and it is uphill. But other things that we have to do in our society are much harder, and much harder because it's not easy to see exactly how to do it. How do you create a just healthcare system? People of goodwill differ greatly about that. But I think about sexual harassment, people of goodwill agree pretty much. And you wouldn't get the most conservative Supreme Court justice and the most liberal disagreeing about that. Justice Scalia, you'll see in my book, wrote some of the landmark opinions in the law of sexual harassment in the workplace. In fact, it was he who wrote the lead opinion in saying that it could be a male who's harassed in the workplace, a real stretch in the law. And so, we have to keep trying, and we have to keep doing better. But I think that it's a struggle that we can win.
Just to mention, there are many notes of thanks that are coming through our Q&A. Here's a comment. Thank you for speaking about love and hearing one another. Often women believe shaming, hate campaigns, and revenge is the way to go. I wonder if you would comment on that.
Well, of course, I already have in a way. I mean, my basic thought, and I developed this in my earlier book, Anger and Forgiveness, is that this retributive attitude, pay them back in kind, proportional payback, is just, it may be evolutionarily hardwired to some degree, but it's a confused kind of thinking. Why should you think that proportional payback does any good for anyone? If you think about capital punishment, I'm just about to teach next week it's a class on opera, so I'm teaching the opera Dead Man Walking, that amazing movie, but also it's an opera about capital punishment. And the parents of those murdered children, they're so miserable, but they somehow think that if they can get this person to be put to death, then they'll have accomplished something. And at one point, talking to Sister Helen, one of them realizes, I'm beginning to think differently. And he's beginning to see that this whole crusade to kill this guy is just not giving them what they want, which is, of course, the restoration of their child. But what should we do when we're wounded? We should do something going forward that makes the world better. I think one very good example of that is the movement Mothers for Drunk Driving. Instead of just trying to kill people as their children have been killed, they try to create better laws that both deter drunk driving and incapacitate the drunk drivers and require them to have stuff attached to their car's ignition that they have to blow through a tube and all that stuff. So that's a constructive movement that has greatly lessened drunk driving. And of course, just teaching the harm it does also helps to lessen it. And, the killing people, and I mean, even metaphorically killing them, ending their careers, I never had much sympathy for that. I think there are strong reasons to report when you've been harmed. And right now, we're all in a university, we're mandatory reporters, meaning that if a student of mine comes to me and says, well, I was groped by another student, usually if it's a faculty member, it goes through a different process. But in any case, if there's any kind of assault or harassment from another student, I have to report it to the Title IX office. At first, I thought that's not a good idea. It violates the woman's privacy. But I've come to think, because I've observed that they play their role very discreetly and they do not violate the woman's confidentiality, that it's a good thing to have mandatory reporting, because otherwise people will just dither and think, oh, well, so-and-so told me this, what should I do about it? And the woman herself might dither and hesitate. Whereas talking to the Title IX officer, she can just decide, make an informed decision going forward about what is this process like, and what will it let her in for? So I think reporting is great. I think it's great also for child abuse. We are also, even though I never teach any children, I'm a mandatory reporter for child abuse because our university does have some programs where there are young children. So if I should see one of these young children not dressed well or seeming to have been beaten or something, then I am required to report that to the Office of Child Welfare. So those things are good because they actually make our culture more accountable. I did not report my instances of sexual harassment and sexual assault. I couldn't have really, because in the case of the sexual assault, I knew the police would have just laughed me out of the office. There was just no way that I would accomplish anything for any woman. But today, I think it's different. Somebody who has been sexually assaulted, my favorite TV program is Law and Order SVU, which means I'm never going to be seated on a jury. I'm summarily dismissed by the defense when I said that. But anyway, it shows you that there are specialized police officers who know how to talk to victims. And that's what their specialty is being advocates for victims. So I think, the whole system has changed and you can report without having this horrible experience of people laughing at you, calling you a whore, and not taking your story seriously. So now the climate in which you report is different. Sexual harassment, of course, what people worried about in the old days, and they still worry about today, is that they'll get a bad name and people will think they're troublemakers. And of course, that has happened. The professor who harassed me, my thesis advisor, and I've written a whole article about him, so everyone knows about this. He harassed every woman in that class. So it was kind of equal opportunity harassment. And he never did retaliate. He retaliated actually only against the ones who said yes. It was very strange self-contempt that he had. But in any case, women were harmed. The climate of dignity in the seminar was harmed. So one woman courageously went to the department chair and reported him, but there was no grievance procedure, no structure. So all the chair could do is call the guy in and say, so-and-so reported that you did this to her. And of course, then he did go ballistic and he did retaliate. So that's what people worry about. But since there are now impartial rules and structures, it's much easier because you simply point to the rule and you say this rule was violated. And the person, of course, is supposed to be on notice. I mean, each faculty member in my university has to redo the sexual harassment training every single year. And you don't get to walk into the classroom unless you've redone I tried to say this year, because it was COVID and I didn't really want to do this long online training course because I thought they'll probably get some things wrong and I'll be annoyed by it and so forth. But anyway, I said to the chair of the committee, here's a book that I've written. Don't you think I know enough about this topic now? And this, in that one case, she did say, okay, you can be let off for that 1 year, but I'm sure next year I'll have to do it again. And that's good because we ought to go through this every year. People forget these things. So I think that reporting is always very hard. You take your career in your hands. When you think about the federal judiciary, the people who blew the whistle on Alex Kaczynski were women who had left the law. They had become journalists. And so they were free. And even though he was exposed and he was forced into a kind of early retirement, of course, he retired and he got to keep his full pension and so forth. Even though he kind of lost, nonetheless, women who are at law firms still have been quite reluctant to denounce him because the culture of dependency is so strong. I think it's better in the academy because once you get out there, you're actually publishing stuff and everyone can read it. So your thesis advisor becomes a thing of the past to a great extent. But, people still are very frightened. And I think, therefore, it's important that anonymity should be respected in the complaint process, as it is with Title IX. And then, it's up to the woman to decide when and whether to come forward. I had other things on my mind. When I told my story of sexual harassment, I wanted to think who would be harmed because the harasser was dead. But I had to think about his wife. Was I going to make this woman who had already been betrayed countless times, was I going to make her life more of a misery and shame her? And I decided, thinking about it, that no, both the wife and the children had really had a very dim view of him for a long time, and they would not really be hurt by that. But then there are other cases like that where you have to think of the totality of the impact of your behavior on all the people involved. And so there's another case of a sexual harasser where I was reluctant to write it all up and put it on a blog and so on, because I thought, well, there are two wives of this person who are still living. He's not living. And both of them, why should I make their life a misery? And for all I know, they may quite love him. And then there are also students who are loyal to him. So I think coming forward is very complicated. And I guess I tend to think about it from too many points of view, and therefore I see how hard it is to do. But when the women did come to me, there were two women who came to me with a story of sexual harassment by a fellow graduate student. I did urge them to talk to the Title IX counselor. They came forward, they told their stories to the counselor in confidentiality. And then the counselor said, well, here's what's going to happen. You will have to give your narrative to the perp, and he will have to see that narrative. And of course, he'll know who it was who did it, presumably. And so, here's what's involved, and you'll have to go back and forth. You won't have to be in the same room with him, but you'll have to exchange accounts. This was not rape, so it was in a way easier for them because it was groping at a party. I think it's easier than when you actually are physically violated in this most deeply intimate way. I mean, groping is a violation, but it's not the same as rape. And they decided they would go forward. And then the process played itself out. And you know what? He was given a certain sentence that was probation and drug and alcohol counseling and sexual harassment counseling. And after the probationary year, he came back and he finished his degree, got a job in another country. And I think it was important for him that he did end up in another country because he was very, very ashamed by the process. But, he wasn't killed. And I think that's important too. I at the time, I said to this guy, you'll forgive me, please, but I can't be on your thesis committee anymore because I don't want to write the sort of letter that would get you a job until I know that you're not likely to do that again. But if you fulfill your probationary year and then you come back to me and say, look, I understand what I did and I licked the alcohol problem, et cetera, then I'll consider rejoining the committee. He never did come back to me. And I told other faculty, please tell him, but he was so ashamed that he didn't want to face me again. And I understand that. It's devastating, of course, to be convicted of such an offense. So anyway, what I'm saying is I think there should always be a reintegration possible if the person genuinely seeks it. And I would always want to extend that. That's why in my chapter on the performing arts, I say that Domingo is different from all the others because he has given a public apology. And moreover, there's such a complicated balance sheet because he's also helped women so much. And there are women in the opera world who say, this is terrible what's happening to him because he was one of the most helpful to women and women's careers. And I've listened to those women too. So I guess I think his apology was a little bit ham-handed, talking about, he's from a different culture, it was different era. But to some extent, I think there's truth to that. After all, he is 80 years old and he probably never listened and learned in the last 30 years because he was just so big that he didn't have to listen. And I think the signs are that now he has listened, and I would certainly be prepared to, entertain the possibility of hiring. I'm not involved in hiring at Lyric Opera. I just write the program notes, but I do teach this opera class with Anthony Freund, and the head of our board of trustees is a feminist lawyer. So I think, if somebody wanted to bring him in for a concert, there would be a big debate. But personally, right now, I would be in favor of bringing him in. Whereas with the other three, and Levine, who for years ruined the lives and the psyches of young men, and everyone knew about it, and no one did anything about it. That's somebody, I just think his whole psychology was just so committed to this pattern of exploitation and abuse that he wasn't going to seek redemption, except maybe in the other world, heaven knows. But so there are those differences.
I've got just one last question for you from an attendee. Would you talk about the philosophers who most affected the foundation of your writings? Similarly, has religion played a role in any way in the foundation of your moral views?
Well, I'm a convert to Judaism from Episcopal Christianity. And I guess I've always been interested in religion, and I'm a practicing Jew, and I'm a member of my synagogue. And I do think that that plays some role in my thinking about anger and mercy and so forth. But of course, there are Jews of all kinds, and you would find Jews defending retributivism as well as you would find people defending mercy and empathy and so on. So I'm sure my philosophical views I bring to the synagogue. And my cantor and I once had a public forum about anger, where he sang music exemplifying different attitudes to anger, and I gave little speeches about different attitudes to anger. But, I don't think at this age I'm going to change all that much in my view. However, I guess, so early on, who were the people who influenced me most? Of course, there were no women around. The women that you would think of as being famous at that time, like Hannah Arendt, she was from such a different philosophical tradition, never met her, never had any influence from her. The only woman older than me that I would say has influenced me was Iris Murdoch, both novelist and philosopher. Wonderful, wonderful person. And I knew her personally a bit. And so she was one. But, the big influences, I guess, because of course, Murdoch was not teaching anymore by the time that I came along. She had resigned her fellowship in Oxford to just write novels. The philosopher Bernard Williams was a huge influence. He was a very great philosopher, and he brought into philosophy the importance of emotions, the complexity of human life. And, so everything I do, I think, sort of takes off from that, the permission that he gave. He was an RAF pilot, and no one could sort of talk down to him or think that he was a sissy. So this stern RAF pilot making room for the emotions and the imagination, it was a door through which I and many others walked through. But he was also a friend and an absolutely superb human being. He was a feminist. He had married Shirley Williams, who's still living, now in the House of Lords. And so very early on, he actually shared childcare with a powerful politician. They got divorced, but he never lost that commitment to equal division of domestic labor. His second wife was also a powerful professional. She's still living also, Patricia, and was the head of she was a leading editor at Cambridge University Press and later at Princeton University Press. So anyway, Bernard was a feminist, and he once told me that he thought that I should report my thesis advisor for sexual harassment because he knew that we all suffered it. Of course, he didn't have a real practical goal to recommend because the reporting just wouldn't have gone anywhere without a structure. So I listened and very gratefully listened, but I didn't do it because, it would have just meant nothing would happen. But anyway, he understood the problem. And no one else did at that time. There are others. Stanley Cavell is another philosopher who's influenced me greatly. I taught a class with him when I was a beginning assistant professor, and the willingness that Stanley had to put his own deepest thoughts and deepest feelings out there in front of 500 students, that's how many we had in his class. That was a model for me. And my essay on Plato's Symposium in my book, Fragility of Goodness, that was a lecture for that class because the week before, I was thinking, well, what am I going to say to 500 freshmen, and not all freshmen, but mostly, about this dialogue that so many people have written about? Well, I had to put my own deepest thoughts and feelings about passion, about reason. I put them out there, and I didn't care if it was really strange and unorthodox, because Stanley hadn't cared either. And he, again, gave me permission to be myself. So that's what both of these men had in common, that they gave the permission to be yourself, and they valued the self that came through when you opened that door.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nussbaum, for your enlightening talk and for your scholarship. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And it's so good to be in my old hometown of Philadelphia.